Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to get into something that sounds a bit futuristic, maybe, but it's really about how we use the internet right now, often without, fully grasping what's going on under the hood,
Exactly. We're talking about the machine.
right? The machine.
Mm.
And it's not some like Terminator scenario. It's more about um, this idea explored in Diedrich's podcast, Digital EQ Reimagined.
Yeah, it refers to all those interconnected online systems, the incentives behind them, and how they, well, sort of subtly influence our emotions when we're online.
And just so everyone knows, our source material for this is purely from the transcript of that specific episode, episode 7. Welcome to the machine.
hmm And our mission today really is to understand how these systems collect our emotional data, how they use it, maybe even monetize it.
And why understanding all this actually matters for, your own experience online.
It's a bit of a shift from our last deep dive where we looked at internal tools, emotional reset strategies.
Yeah, this time we're looking outwards at the external forces shaping things. And this whole machine idea really came into focus for Diedrich during, well, a pretty normal conversation, actually.
Yeah, he mentions talking to someone involved with his podcast sound design, I think, and this person was a bit skeptical, saying something like,
Oh, yeah, I remember this quote. It was like, come on, Diedrich. I mean, no one's really using emotional data the way you're describing it.
exactly. And Diedrich's reaction is key. He says he paused, not because the guy was wrong, he was wrong, but because that misses the point.
Right. His point was, no one's writing a check labeled sadness. No one's handing over a receipt for rage.
But if your emotions are being collected and businesses are buying access to those feelings to sell you something or shape how you behave, then your emotions are part of a transaction. It's just one you weren't told you were part of.
That hits hard. An unnoticed transaction involving our feelings.
Precisely. And that sets the stage for the whole episode title, Welcome to the Machine, and its theme. These systems, their incentives, and the emotional cost of being constantly connected.
So where does Diedrich see this machine most obviously working day to day?
Well, social media platforms are like ground zero. He calls them gold mines of emotional data, which makes sense, right? They need us engaged.
And they collect way more than just likes or posts. Diedrich points out TikTok, for instance. They look at how you type, your scrolling patterns.
Even how long you pause on something. Meta does similar things. Clicks, hovers, location data. It's all in their privacy policies, supposedly to, improve your experience.
But Diedrich argues it's building something else, an emotional profile.
Yeah, not emotional like feelings, but emotional in a data sense. It's a map of what gets a reaction out of you, what makes you click angrily, or what makes you watch for longer.
So it learns your triggers.
Pretty much. And that profile is then used to feed you content that keeps you hooked, keeps you engaged. Maybe not what's best for you, but what keeps you scrolling.
And that's the monetizable part, right? Selling access to those tendencies, not your actual feelings, but the ability to target you when you might be feeling a certain way.
Exactly. It's how the machine operates. Not one single bad guy, but this interplay of prompts, content, triggering an emotion, and then, well, maybe showing you an ad related to it.
Diedrich shared a personal story about this, didn't he, with Instagram?
He did. He talked about his feed suddenly being flooded with this quiet wealth aesthetic, minimalist luxury, perfect bodies, serene places.
Yeah.
And he realized it wasn't random. The algorithm was sort of mirroring his own insecurities back at him, offering this image of who he felt he had to become.
He said, it wasn't showing me who I am. It was showing me who I thought I had to become to feel enough.
That's quite an insight. It really shows how platforms can subtly shape how you see yourself by tacking into those vulnerabilities. So his counter is what he calls digital EQ in action.
Which starts with just being more aware.
Yeah, simple things like using a scroll time tracker, not to beat yourself up, but just to notice patterns. When do you scroll most? How do you feel after?
Okay.
And setting emotional bookmarks. Basically consciously checking in, what is this platform giving me emotionally, and what is it taking away?
That makes sense. Shifting gears a bit, Diedrich then looks at how businesses use this,
Oh.
right? How the machine works there.
Right. He says businesses are moving beyond just knowing what we buy to trying to predict why we buy, and emotional targeting is becoming, a big part of that strategy.
Trying to time suggestions for when we're most vulnerable.
That seems to be the idea. He mentions that old 2015 example, the retailer figuring out shoppers were likely pregnant from buying patterns. That was like an early version.
And now, with emotional AI, it's potentially much more sophisticated.
Oh, yeah. Things like sentiment analysis on customer service calls or emails, maybe even mood tracking in stores someday, all trying to create what he calls emotional readiness for a sale.
He had an example from LinkedIn too, didn't he? Feeling pressured.
Yes. He described it as performance anxiety disguised as progress. That feeling you get scrolling through endless thought leadership
Like
posts.
you're constantly falling short.
Exactly. The platform almost manufactures that feeling of lack, subtly saying, here's what you're not doing, but hey, we can show you how to fix that.
It's a subtle manipulation almost.
It can feel that way. And Diedrich, speaking as an entrepreneur himself, acknowledges data is powerful for business, but he draws a really firm line.
What was his quote? Something about emotions not being a funnel.
Yeah.
Your emotions are not a funnel, your vulnerability is not a marketing opportunity, and your sadness should never be someone's KPI. Pretty clear ethical stance.
Very clear. So what's the defense against this side of the machine?
He talks about emotional sovereignty and EQ power moves, practical things again.
Like pausing when you see a targeted ad, just asking yourself, is this my feeling or is the algorithm triggering something? Using browser tools that block some of this profiling.
Using incognito mode more often.
That too. It disrupts the pattern building and just practicing a bit of digital mindfulness, especially before buying something online, asking that question, is this my emotion talking or their algorithm?
Okay, so we've covered social media, businesses.
Yeah.
What about government? How does Diedrich see the machine operating there?
Well, the angle shifts slightly. Governments use tech for safety and security, obviously. But Diedrich points out these same tools can easily become tools for monitoring, maybe even controlling emotions.
How so?
There's a lot of experimentation globally with emotion detection tech, analyzing facial expressions, voice tone, biometrics, trying to spot deception or threats.
Where is this being used or tested?
Airports, schools, even public housing in some places, trying to automate threat assessment based on perceived emotional states.
But that sounds prone to error or bias.
That's a huge concern Diedrich raises. We know predictive policing algorithms can have biases. Imagine similar biases in systems reading mood, someone to be wrongly flagged as agitated or suspicious just because the system doesn't understand their baseline or cultural expression.
Are there concrete examples of this happening now?
He mentions China using emotional surveillance in schools and workplaces, and also the use of AI at borders, trying to assess threat levels from emotional cues, often without consent.
So this isn't just a what-if scenario.
No, he stresses it's happening now. It's a present reality being explored and implemented. And look, safety is important. Everyone wants to feel secure.
But at what cost to our emotional privacy?
That's the question Diedrich poses. He argues you shouldn't have to give up your sovereignty to feel safe. True safety, he says, comes from trust, consent, boundaries, transparency, not just surveillance.
So the EQ power moves here are about awareness and maybe some tech measures.
Yeah, staying informed about this tech, about laws like the EU AI Act or the US AI Bill of Rights. Using tools that block facial tracking where possible, being mindful of always on mics.
And remembering, what was the line?
Just because you're in public doesn't mean your emotions are public property.
Good one to remember. Okay, the last piece Diedrich looks at is education. How does the machine manifest there?
It's an interesting tension. Education should foster emotional intelligence, right? But the rise of ed tech platforms might actually push towards a kind of emotional conformity.
How? Through data collection again.
Yes, but it's more than just grades. Some platforms use facial recognition to track engagement or typing patterns to sense frustration. And often, Diedrich notes, students, especially kids, have no idea this data is being collected or how it's used.
Now, and there's behavior management software too.
Right, software that flags students based on maybe their tone of voice, word choice in essays, or disciplinary history, which raises big questions.
Like whose definition of normal emotion are we using?
Exactly, especially with diverse cultures, neurodiversity, kids dealing with trauma. Who gets to decide what's an acceptable emotional display?
And Diedrich also mentioned a potential downside to focusing too much on testing.
Yeah, the quiet erosion of empathy. If schools prioritize metrics over teaching emotional vocabulary, regulation, self-reflection, you might end up with kids who are digitally savvy but maybe less emotionally attuned.
That's a worrying thought. So what can parents, educators, students do?
Diedrich emphasizes prioritizing emotional literacy in schools, demanding transparency from schools about the ed tech they use and the data they collect.
And listening to kids.
Most importantly, yes, letting young people name their own feelings without being penalized and empowering them to question these systems that try to read and categorize them.
So wrapping it all up, the machine isn't one thing.
No, it's this web. Social platforms, businesses, government, education. They're not necessarily malicious actors, but interconnected systems driven by attention, behavior, and, yeah, our emotions.
But we're not just data points. We're not just products of algorithms.
Absolutely not. Diedrich's message is ultimately one of empowerment, I think. Even though this all sounds huge, maybe overwhelming.
Reclaiming that emotional sovereignty happens in small steps.
Exactly. It starts with just noticing, pausing, thinking. Is this feeling mine? Or is it being nudged by the system, making conscious choices?
We have a right to platforms that respect our privacy,
Mm.
education that sees the whole person.
In a world where our feelings aren't just another commodity to be bought and sold.
And Diedrich does offer some hope, right? He is looking at positive examples next time.
Yeah, the next deep dive focuses on people and companies trying to use data ethically, showing it is possible to do the right thing. So that's something I look forward to.
Definitely a crucial conversation to keep having.
Until then, stay digitally sovereign, stay digitally smart, and remember Diedrich sign off. Stronger emotions, not stronger algorithms.